This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and today is Saturday, and that means it's time for Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. Today, I want to talk to you about 10 cards in Phyrexia All Will Be One that you should stop playing. These are all 10 of them are cards that are actively hurting your ability to win, and they're cards that people are playing and taking higher than they should. So, as usual, when I do one of these videos for a format, I use 17 lands data to sort of help me make my case to show you that there is data to back up what it is that I'm saying. And if you don't know what 17 lands is, you can go to 17lands.com. It tracks limited data on Magic Arena, and not everyone's data who plays Magic Arena is tracked. You have to sign up for it. So the data we're talking about involves players who are significantly better than average because obviously they're interested in improving their game and in using data like this. They're not just casual players. So obviously in normal Magic, the win percentage of everyone combined would be 50% because Magic is a zero-sum game. But the win percentage for this format on 17 lands on Magic Arena is 54.7%. So that's a significantly higher win percentage than the average. And to sort of give you a baseline, so you know what I'm talking about, I want to talk about Shrapnel Slinger. This is not a bad card. This is one that has a win percentage of 54.8%. So, it's very average. It's a card that has a win percentage pretty close to the overall win percentage of people on 17 lands, and it's taken around the 9th pick. The cards I'm going to talk about in this video are all taken earlier or around the same time as Shrapnel Slinger, but have significantly lower win percentages. And the particular number I'm using for win rate is the games in hand win rate. This is the win rate of a card when it ends up in your hand at any point during a game. This sort of win rate takes into account the times when a card's stuck in your hand and can't cast it and things like that. It doesn't only count when you can cast a card because you're not really getting the whole story if that's what you look like. So let's dive right in with these 10 cards from Phyrexia All Will Be One that you should stop playing if you want to do better in the limited format. We're going to start with the one that is the worst, and that is Vata Rebirth. It has a win percentage of 42.3%, which is very bad. It lowers your win percentage by 6.6% when you draw it. Now, this data, the change in your win percentage when drawn isn't a perfect way to say that a card is bad, but I do think it helps tell the story here that just drawing this card is worse for you than not drawing it when it's in your deck. So, that's the case with Vata Rebirth, and it's taken around the 9.96th pick, which isn't a high pick. People aren't taking it crazy high, but they're taking it at a similar spot as Shrapnel Slinger, which has a win percentage more than 10% higher, about 12% higher than Vata Rebirth. This card is just too slow. Someday we'll have limited formats again where this sort of grindy engine type card can do its thing, and there are a few of them in this format. I mean, Churning Reservoir actually works, but this one's too expensive, too slow, doesn't do anything until it gets enough oil counters, and then the thing it does isn't that good. So shouldn't really be playing it. Playing it is often just like you're mulliganing almost because the card isn't going to do anything. It's a card I see people play. It's a card people are taking, again, relatively highly given how awful it is, and they should stop if they want to win more. From here, let's look at Copper Longlegs. So this has a win percentage of 50.2%. Again, that might not sound that bad because, the win percentage for everyone, if you take it all together, is 50%, in Magic. And this is higher than that, but as I pointed out, 54.7% is the overall win percentage on 17 lands. So this is very, very bad. And this isn't a card that's like nearly as terrible as something like Vata Rebirth. It adds to the board, it does a thing. It's not the worst card ever, but you have to look at cards relative to the other cards you could be playing at this point. And playing this 2-mana 1/3 with Reach that can rather expensively proliferate it just doesn't do enough in the format. You know, you just aren't interested in a creature like this. Blocking is hard in this format, and a lot of these defensive creatures are extra bad, and that is, you know, Copper Longlegs is a result of that. And by the way, blocking is bad, as I've talked about in the past, because format has lots of really good tricks that just utterly blow you out if you're not careful. This is taken around the 9.85 pick, so right around 10. And it is another card that lowers your win percentage when you draw it, which shows you how insignificantly it really adds to the board, especially in the later stages of the game, if you lose 2.6% on your win percentage when you draw it, you know, in the later stages. Next, let's talk about Necrogen Communion. Of all the cards I'm going to talk about, it has one of the, I guess it has, as we'll see, the second highest win rate. It's still not very good, 51.1%. Lowers your win percentage by 0.2% when it's drawn. And this is taken around the 7.68 pick, like that's the average. That is way too high for this card. Like, yeah, I get the upside on this card. Slapping it on your evasive creature and hoping you're just going to poison your opponent out is kind of cool. And, you know, something to keep in mind here is none of these cards' win percentages is 0. Like, there are games you're going to win with these cards and not just happen to have them in play, but they'll actually win you the game actively. But the thing is, the situations where these cards work out are low. They don't happen often enough, and that's why these cards have low win rates. And yeah, if you can stick a Necrogen Communion on an evasive, toxic creature and your opponent can't do anything about it all game, they're going to lose pretty quickly. But the problem is, it's not that hard to deal with. Sure, it does keep you from getting 2-for-1'd, as long as your opponent doesn't respond to it, in which case you do get 2-for-1. But because it brings the creature back when that creature dies, but it's just not meaningful enough. You end up using up a card, you know, that doesn't do that much. It's almost always the case that if you look at an aura and say, you know, what is this good on? And if your answer is, well, a creature that's already good, it's probably not worth playing, because you need to have something worth putting it on to begin with. The best auras are the ones that make a creature into that threat, and Necrogen Communion doesn't do enough in that direction, so it has such a low win rate. Next up, there is Watchful Blister Zoe. So, you know, a 6-mana 4/4 flyer that dies and draws you a card when it does. That's what this is going to do at a minimum, usually. That doesn't sound so bad. And, you know, in limited formats about 5 years ago, it would be a decent card. But in this format, it has a win rate of 50.2%. Now, one thing that's interesting about this particular card, it's sort of the flip side of some of the others we've seen, it actually does increase your win rate when it's drawn by 1.3%. But when it's in your opening hand, it's awful. You know, you don't want this card in your opening hand. You don't need 6 drops in your opening hand. You have to add actively to the board in this format early, interact with the board, and this being in your hand means you're not doing it. So this is a card that gets stuck in your hand, and that's its main problem. It's taken around the 7.8 area in terms of when it's picked, which is much higher than Shrapnel Slinger, despite Shrapnel Slinger, you know, having a much higher win percentage. And yeah, I mean, it just doesn't do enough. You do need top end in this format, but when everyone else is playing like 4/5s with haste and stuff, the Blister Zoe does not look very good as a 6-mana 4/4 flyer. Next up, it's Magmatic Sprinter. So this has the highest win rate of any card on this list, which, you know, this is a list of bad cards. So that's not much. That's not saying much. It has a win rate of 51.2%, lowers your win percentage by 2.7 when it's drawn. And this one has taken the second highest of any card on the list, around the 6.5, you know, pick. That's bad. I mean, like this is a card that I thought would be pretty nice in the format. It's going to be on my like retrospective into the format cards I got wrong, because I think I gave it like a B- in this set review. I just thought the upside of putting oil counters on things and having haste and being able to come down and put more oil counters on things would be pretty sweet. And there are some times in some decks where maybe you can get away with playing this if you have enough oil stuff going on. But the problem with the card is that it only sticks around, you know, for one turn, basically, even if you put the oil on it. And this isn't really a format where you want to be playing a card that puts oil counters on things and then doesn't stay on the board itself. So, you know, a card that doesn't permanently add to the board meaningfully is a liability, as it has been in most limited formats lately. And that's what really makes this card underperform. Next up, there is Meldweb Strider, which has a win rate of 50.5%. That is pretty low, obviously. It does increase your win rate by 0.1 when it's drawn. So sort of like Watchful Blister Zoe, it's an expensive card that's awful in your opening hand, and not the worst thing ever when you draw it in the later stages of the game. It's taken around pick 9.7. You know, it's kind of cool that it can turn itself into a creature once. If you can proliferate, it can do it more than once. But vehicles have this big problem, even this one, where you need an additional board state to make it a more permanent presence on the board, and you just can't do it in this format. So that's what makes it underperform. Next up, I've got Adaptive Spore Singer. Has the same win rate as Meldweb Strider of 50.5%, and it's taken around around 9.2. Interestingly, I wouldn't have thought this about this particular card. It lowers your win rate by 2.2 when it's drawn. So, this is an interesting card because I think if you just look at it, you're like, okay, I mean, a 3-mana 2/2 with Vigilance, and then it has these two options, both of which can be useful, especially +2/+2 in Vigilance to one of my creatures. That can help me send in a toxic creature or whatever, right? And, yeah, it can do that, but these understated creatures are extra bad in a format, especially where red-green just has all of these big creatures, these efficient creatures that just make the Spore Singer look very bad. So you don't want to play it in green to begin with because you don't need to. And then the Proliferate effect ended up being really underwhelming. Like in general, Proliferate has been underpowered, weaker than I expected in this format. So that effect is, not entirely meaningless, but, not, a 3-mana 2/2 that enters the battlefield and proliferates would not be worth playing in this format. And that's, one of the options. Obviously, the other option is more meaningful more frequently, but it just doesn't do enough. There are a lot of board states where this doesn't help you attack that much. I think it also has something to do with the fact that you usually want to leave your mana up ahead of your attacks because you're usually playing tricks in this format. And that, hurts the idea of wanting to play this card to begin with. Next up, I've got Plague Nurse. So, yeah, this has a 50.7% win rate. It's taken around 8.8, and it lowers your win rate by 1.4 when you draw it. That is, as all these cards are, not very good. And this is another card where I think if you just look at it, like, okay, 4-mana, 3/4, Toxic 2, and it can increase the Toxic on my other creatures. But there's a few problems here. Number one, this is a Toxic creature with 4 toughness that costs 4 mana. And that might not sound terrible, just hearing that right away. But the problem is Hex Gold Slash is in this format. And against a red opponent, this is going to get killed for 1 mana so often, and it does. Like if you play this, this is seriously a major factor in why its win rate is so low. And they're going to gain so much tempo on you that it's absurd. And then the other problem is you just never have time in this format to be using this activated ability. It's too expensive. It's not like Necrogen Rot Priest, which just has a static effect that makes all your stuff poison better. Like, that's what this card would have needed to be successful, some sort of static effect that made your toxic stuff more poisonous, but it doesn't. It makes you pay a bunch of mana. It's not that efficient, and the Hex Gold Slash problem is very real. And, there are some other 4 toughness toxic creatures that you can get away with in this format, but that's because their upside is significantly more. Like the 4-mana 2/4 Menace in black, being evasive and having toxic is way different than what this is. And then, of course, the 4-mana 3/4 Communion Rot Priest, I think, with toxic that lets you return something and then makes a might. This is better because you add to the board no matter what, because you get a might token. This doesn't do that. You play it and then it dies. And it's not even just Hex Gold Slash. There's lots of other cheap removal that kills it. That's just like the sort of poster child of why this card is bad. All right. Next up, there is Prosthetic Injector, and our last two are the 2 cards that are taken the highest despite these very low win rates. So Prosthetic Injector has a win rate of 50. It's taken around the 6th pick, and it lowers your win rate by 2.6 when you draw it. This just doesn't do enough. I was talking earlier, if you have equipment or auras, and you're like, what would this be good to put on? And the answer is a good creature, then it's not good. You know, this doesn't turn a creature, doesn't make a creature significantly better. You know, adding toxic to things. Again, it's sort of like Necrogen Communion. Slap this on an evasive creature that already has toxic and it can poison someone out quickly if they can't do anything about it. But there are a lot of games where this just doesn't give you a card worth the value or even close to it because the upgrade it offers your creatures is so minimal. You know, even as cheap as this is to play and to equip, it still does not do enough to warrant being played in your deck. And lastly, we've got Necrosquito, which has a win rate of 51.1%. It's taken around somewhere between the 5th and 6th pick at 5.6. That is really high to be taking Necrosquito. I was sort of surprised to see that myself when I saw this because I've never really seen this card be impressive. You know, it doesn't have Toxic, but it has the same basic problem as Plague Nurse. It's a 4-mana creature with 2 toughness when it first comes down. Dies to a bunch of 1 mana removal and 2 mana removal in this format. And that sort of downside is too big on a card that doesn't give you any sort of value, even in the case when it gets removed right away. And then you sort of have to jump through some relatively significant hoops to grow this at all. You know, if you can get some counters on this with Proliferate or by having things die, you know, it can become a threat. But the amount of mana you spend on it and the amount of effort it takes to make it into a threat has just been too much to ask, you know, in this format. If this format had a more real sacrifice deck in black-red, this would probably be a lot better, but it doesn't really. There's not really a consistent sacrifice deck that this card can really flourish in. All right, so those are my 10 bad cards that you should stop playing in this format. For pretty much all these, you really shouldn't be playing them. Like I said with the Sprinter, there's some corner cases where it can make your deck, but most of these actively make your deck worse by playing them. All right, as usual, let's close things out here with a Crack-a-Pack. This is a pack one, pick one situation where I'll talk about every card in the pack, how I feel about it in the format, and tell you what I would first pick. Our first common is the Dross Pits. Spheres are fine, but you really only ever run one, and you certainly don't take them highly. Furnace Strider is next. This is the 5-mana 4/5 haste I was talking about that makes Watchful Blister Zoe very sad. It is quite good. It's one of the better commons. You know, it's kind of a card you basically always want in your red decks, especially if you're in red-green. But it's good in all the red decks. It can give other things haste thanks to its oil counters. It just ends up being a beating if you play it ahead of schedule especially. I don't think I would be super happy about first picking one, but it's not a complete disaster either. Next up, we've got Leonin Lightbringer. This has been a pretty medium card that works okay in the red-white deck because, you know, it likes equipment, but you don't really play it anywhere else. And even in that deck, this isn't really the payoff you're hoping for. It's just an okay thing to have. Certainly don't first pick that. Draw Skull Bomb is next. You know, the Skull Bombs that aren't blue or white have all kind of been underwhelming. Like, I only find myself playing them if I'm desperate. The reason the blue and white ones are more acceptable is because the blue-white deck likes artifacts, so it gets extra value out of them. You can animate them, you know, with a 3-mana 2/3 that can animate artifacts and stuff. You can't do that in any of the other colors, and they're all kind of slow and clunky in a format where that's very dangerous. Forge Hammer Centurion is next. This is not as exciting of an oil card as Furnace Strider. It has that same, basically this trigger on all of the cards that have it, that are all black and red. This trigger where you get an oil counter if a creature or artifact goes to your graveyard. It is not something that has performed well in the format overall. Every card that has that trigger has kind of underwhelmed. I mean, the one exception is probably the 1-mana 1/1 Trampler, but that starts with such a good rate and gets bigger, and it likes oil counters. It comes with oil counters already, which is crucial, whereas the Centurion doesn't. Like, you have to build up oil counters. It does have a powerful effect if you can do it, but it's definitely not something you take early. I'm still on Furnace Strider. Next up, we've got Axiom Engraver. This has been a solid little oil creature. The things that do come into play with oil counters on them all got an extra bump in the format, partly because of the red-green deck, which has a bunch of cards that pay you off for having oil counters in play, and not having to work for those oil counters like you don't have to on the Strider or on the Engraver. Like, that's a big difference from the Centurion. So The engraver's effect is also pretty nice. I talked about it in the video, my early video about things I already knew I was wrong about, and this is one of the cards. Just turns out that, rummaging for free is pretty real. Still taking Furnace Strider over it, but it's probably second now. Next up, we have Complete Devotion. This is one of those tricks that makes it very hard for you to block ever. Not only does it give +2/+2 to a creature, but if that creature has Toxic, you get to draw a card. So if you try to block with your Copper Longlegs, you're often just going to get blown out and 2-for-1 by a card like this. And, the 2-for-1 potential is real. And it's such a good trick that I think I would consider. I think it and Furnace Strider are sort of neck and neck right now in terms of, being things I would first pick here. I don't think I would love if either of them end up being what we take, but they are both passable. Maze's Mantle is next. This has been a decent trick. Costing more. The 1 and 2 mana tricks are all better. Once you're talking about 3 mana, you're talking about, more mana, significantly more mana, where you're starting to hamper your board development more just to play a trick, and that's less than ideal. It's okay, but, not better than Complete Devotion. Next up, it's Shieldred's Head Cleaver. This is the 4 toughness toxic creature I was talking about that I think is passable, whereas the Plague Nurse isn't, because coming with Menace in this format has been pretty nice. Works really well with tricks like Complete Devotion. Toxic 2 really can allow this to help you get to Corrupted in black-white decks. I would still take Furnace Strider and Complete Devotion over it, but it's probably... it's kind of comparable to Lightbringer, where it's a card you play in a deck, but it's not really that great. Prologue to Pheresis is next. This is, okay if you're in blue-black or blue-red, but neither of those are places I really want to end up. And if you really want Prologue to Pheresis, you're probably going to be able to wheel them because nobody else wants them. So it's not what we take. So just looking at the comments, man, it's close between Complete Devotion and Furnace Strider. I think I would go Furnace Strider in the end, maybe, just because it works in a wider variety of decks. But at the same time, Complete Devotion, all the white decks have Toxic in them, so maybe that's not true. It's hard. Hopefully we don't have to make a decision between them, because that is a close pick for me. Let's look at our uncommons now. Next up, we've got Oxida Finisher. This has been a little better than I expected. The red-white equipment deck, I think, is one of the better decks in the format. It doesn't always have that much synergy, but if you have 4 or 5 equipment in your deck, which isn't that hard thanks to the Mirrodin mechanic, the Finisher isn't a bad, finisher to have at the top of your curve. Playing it for 5 feels pretty good. It, rumbles really, really well. I think I would still take Furnace Strider or Devotion ahead of it. However, our next uncommon is going to be our new first pick, and it's Evolving Adaptive. This is, this format has a bunch of good 1-drops. I'm trying to think if there's another one. I think this is the best 1-drop in the format, at least at common and uncommon. Starts out, brings an oil counter along for the ride, which is important as a 1-mana 1/1, but adding oil counters to it is very easy. You just, play creatures, and, this is frequently going to be a 3/3 on turn 3 and attacking. It gets really good with anything that puts oil counters on stuff, like Churning Reservoir or the trick that puts oil counters on things. It just ends up growing throughout the game, becoming more of a problem, proliferates good with it. So Evolving Adaptive is definitely what we take, and I don't think it's close. Furnace Strider and Complete Devotion, like I said, both cards that if I had to walk away from this pack with them as my first pick, wouldn't be thrilled, but I wouldn't be upset. Everything else I'd be pretty upset so far. And that's also true of our next card, which is Minor Misstep, which is one of the least playable cards in the set. If you're wondering why I don't talk about that card, it's because nobody's playing it. Everyone knows this one's bad, so you don't need to talk about that kind of card. And then our rare isn't a great one. It's the Monumental Facade. It's not terrible. I actually do think it's playable in a deck that is heavy on the oil counters, which usually means red-green, blue-green, or blue-red. But it's, it's sort of a medium payoff card, probably worse than medium, but very average payoff card for those sorts of decks. Putting oil counters on your Evolving Adaptive with it feels pretty good and stuff, but you really need a bunch of cards that care about oil counters to begin with, or it's not worth playing, and even when you do have them, it's nothing special. So easy Evolving Adaptive here in the end, followed by either Furnace Strider or Complete Devotion. I could see going either way. So that's the Crackaback. That'll do it for this week's Nizzanotes. I think next week I'll be back with the flip side where I talk about cards that should be taken more highly and that you should be playing more if you want to increase your win rate. We've also got right around the corner Shadows over Innistrad Remastered, or is it called Innistrad Remastered? I don't know. Something remastered, and it's a new limited format that's going to be on Arena that combines a bunch of cards from the old Shadows over Innistrad block, and I'll be talking about that format some on here as well. Especially for, I think that'll be especially useful for people who weren't around years ago, I guess 6 years ago, 7 years ago at this point when we had the original Shadows over Innistrad format. So I have that to look forward to as well. Hopefully it ends up being a good limited format. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past videos, you should see some playlists shortly. Thanks for watching.